Hey, what is up, everyone? This story is narrated by my friend Frederick. I hope you guys enjoy it. Watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a fate that some consider an honor beyond measure, while others know it as a curse that extends far beyond the natural span of life. To be interred within a dreadnought sarcophagus is to become something more than human, yet paradoxically, something less. You are transformed into a walking tomb, a fusion of the Imperium's most advanced technology and the broken remnants of a warrior who refused to die. Your consciousness, preserved within a cocoon of life support fluids and neural interface cables, becomes bound to a towering war machine that will stride across battlefields for centuries, perhaps even millennia. But what happens when such a being, already isolated from the living world by layers of adamantium and ceramite, awakens to discover that everything it once fought for has been extinguished? What does it mean for a dreadnought to learn that its entire chapter, the brotherhood that defined its very existence, has been wiped from the annals of history? The experience is one of the most profound tragedies imaginable within the Imperium of man, a catastrophe that strikes at the very core of what it means to be a space marine. To understand the full weight of this horror, we must first understand what a dreadnought truly is, not just as a weapon system or a piece of military hardware, but as a consciousness trapped between life and death, watching the centuries slip past like sand through fingers that no longer exist. A dreadnought begins its existence not in the forges of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but on the battlefield, in moments of supreme violence, when a space marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even the enhanced biology of the Emperor's finest cannot save them. Picture a warrior, perhaps a veteran sergeant who has served for a century, or a captain who has led his brothers through a dozen campaigns. In the heat of battle, this warrior falls. Perhaps his legs are sheared away by the power claw of a tyrannid warrior. Perhaps his torso is crushed by the impact of an orcish war machine. Perhaps his body is burned beyond recognition by the unholy flames of a chaos sorcerer. In any case, the damage is absolute and irreversible. The Space Marine's enhanced physiology, capable of surviving wounds that would kill a normal human 100 times over, reaches its limits. The warrior should die. By every measure of logic and biology, death should claim him within moments. But the chapter's apothecaries, those medical specialists who tend to the physical well-being of their brothers, see something in this dying warrior that makes them hesitate before administering the Emperor's peace. Perhaps this Marine possesses tactical knowledge too valuable to lose, accumulated over decades of warfare. Perhaps his leadership has proven essential to the chapter's success in critical battles. Perhaps he carries within his memory the last words of a fallen hero, or the location of a sacred relic, or simply the living embodiment of traditions that stretch back to the chapter's founding. Whatever the reason, the apothecaries make a decision that will alter this warrior's existence forever. Instead of granting him the honor of dying in battle and joining the Emperor at his side in whatever afterlife awaits the faithful, they choose to preserve him. The process of entombment is both a miracle of technology and an act of profound cruelty, though none involved would ever frame it in such terms. The dying Marine's broken body is rushed to the chapter's tech Marines, those warriors who have trained with the Adeptus Mechanicus to understand the sacred mysteries of the machine. These specialists work with desperate speed, knowing that every moment of delay reduces the chances of success. They carefully extract what remains of the warrior's organic components, those precious few parts that can still sustain life when supported by advanced technology. The brain, naturally, is paramount. The spinal column, if it has survived intact, perhaps portions of the torso containing vital organs that can be maintained through mechanical assistance. Everything else, all the tissue that has been too badly damaged to function, is removed and either consumed in the ceremony of the omophagia or preserved in honored reliquaries. What remains of the warrior is then placed into a sarcophagus, an armored life support chamber that will become his permanent home. This is no simple medical device, but a masterwork of technology that represents the pinnacle of the Imperium's ability to preserve human life in the most extreme circumstances. The sarcophagus is filled with nutrient-rich amniotic fluids, that support the warrior's remaining biological tissue. Neural interface cables are carefully threaded into his brain, creating direct pathways between his consciousness and the machine systems he will come to control. Life support systems monitor every aspect of his physiology, adjusting chemical balances and maintaining the delicate equilibrium that keeps organic tissue alive when it has been reduced to its most basic components. This sarcophagus is then installed into the chest cavity of a Dreadnought chassis, a bipedal war machine that stands between 12 and 15 feet tall, depending on the pattern and modifications. The warrior's consciousness, interfaced directly with the machine through those neural cables, learns to perceive the world through optical sensors rather than eyes, to move massive limbs powered by adamantium pistons rather than muscles, to speak through voxcasters rather than vocal cords. Where once the warrior held a bolter in hands that could feel the weapon's weight and the kick of its recoil, now he controls weapon systems that are integrated directly into his mechanical body. An assault cannon becomes his right arm, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. A power fist or missile launcher serves as his left, able to crush battle tanks or level fortifications. The sensations are translated through the neural interface, but they are not the same as what he once experienced. Everything is filtered through layers of machine code and sensory translation, creating a barrier between the warrior's consciousness and the physical reality he once knew so intimately. But the physical transformation is only the beginning of what it means to become a Dreadnought. The psychological impact of this change cannot be overstated, and it is here that we begin to understand the true horror of what happens when such a being awakens to find its chapter destroyed. A Space Marine's identity is intimately tied to his chapter in ways that civilians can scarcely comprehend. From the moment a young initiate first takes the gene seed of his chapter into his body, beginning the transformation from human to Adeptus Astartes, his entire existence becomes oriented around the brotherhood he has joined. The chapter is not merely a military organization to which he belongs. It is his family, his culture, his religion, his reason for existence. Every ritual he performs, every prayer he speaks, every victory he achieves, all of it is done in the name of and for the glory of his chapter. The bonds between Space Marines go deeper than mere camaraderie or military discipline. These warriors fight side by side for decades, sometimes for centuries. They share experiences that would break ordinary humans, witnessing horrors that defy description and achieving triumphs that border on the miraculous. They know each other's fighting styles so intimately that they can coordinate complex tactical maneuvers with minimal communication. They have seen each other at their strongest and their weakest, have pulled each other from the jaws of death, have mourned together when brothers fall. The relationship between Space Marines of the same chapter is forged in the fires of constant warfare and tempered by shared suffering, creating bonds that transcend anything known in the civilian world. Moreover, a chapter possesses its own unique identity, built up over centuries or even millennia of service to the Imperium. Each chapter has its own heraldry, its own battle honors, its own traditions and customs that distinguish it from all others. Some chapters prefer close combat, training their warriors to be peerless swordsmen who wade into melee with chain weapons roaring. Others specialize in siege warfare, becoming experts in the patient, methodical destruction of fortifications. Still, others focus on rapid deployment and lightning strikes, appearing from nowhere to decapitate enemy leadership before vanishing back into the void. These specializations are not merely tactical preferences but fundamental aspects of the chapter's identity, passed down from generation to generation of warriors. Each chapter also maintains a fortress monastery, a massive fortification that serves as its home base and spiritual center. These structures are often breathtaking in their scale and grandeur, housing not just the chapter's active warriors, but also its recruitment facilities, training grounds, armories, libraries, and chapels. The Fortress Monastery is where Space Marines return between campaigns to rest and resupply, where new initiates undergo their transformation, where the chapter's sacred relics are kept and honored. For many chapters, the Fortress Monastery is located on the chapter's homeworld, creating an additional layer of connection between the warriors and the people from whom they recruit. To lose the fortress monastery is to lose the physical embodiment of the chapter's history and traditions. When a space marine is interred within a dreadnought, he does not lose these connections. If anything, they become even more important, serving as his last anchor to the identity he once possessed. The dreadnought pilot, referred to respectfully as an ancient or a venerable brother, remains a full member of his chapter. He participates in its ceremonies when awakened. He offers counsel to the chapter's leadership, drawing on centuries of accumulated experience. He stands as a living link to the chapter's past, able to share first-hand accounts of battles fought long before any of the current generation of warriors were born. The respect accorded to dreadnoughts within a chapter is immense, bordering on religious veneration in some cases, for these ancient warriors embody everything the chapter holds sacred. But there is a terrible price for this continued existence, one that becomes apparent only over the course of centuries. The process of interfacing a human consciousness with a machine, no matter how sophisticated that machine may be, exacts a toll on the organic mind. The dreadnought pilot experiences time in a profoundly different way than living warriors. Between battles, when the chapter has no immediate need of his services, the dreadnought is placed into a form of stasis sleep. This is not the natural sleep of organic beings, filled with dreams and the gentle processing of memories. It is a deep, artificial unconsciousness induced by the sarcophagus's life support systems, designed to minimize the metabolic demands on the pilot's failing biology and to preserve his sanity during long periods of inactivity. From the perspective of the dreadnought pilot, these periods of stasis pass in an instant. One moment he is being shut down after a battle, his systems cycling into dormancy as tech marines perform their maintenance rituals. The next moment, seemingly without any time having elapsed at all, he is being awakened for the next deployment. But in the objective universe, decades might have passed. Entire generations of space marines might have lived and died. The political landscape of the sector might have shifted dramatically. Technology might have advanced or, more commonly in the Imperium, regressed. The pilot awakens to a world that has moved on without him, finding himself increasingly out of step with the current reality. This temporal dislocation creates a profound sense of isolation that grows worse with each awakening. The first few times a newly interred dreadnought awakens, he still recognizes many of his battle brothers. The chapter master who ordered his entombment is still alive. His former squadmates, aged but still active, greet him with familiarity and shared memories. The fortress monastery looks much as he remembers it, perhaps with a few new decorations or minor structural changes. There is continuity between who he was and what he has become. But as the centuries accumulate, that continuity begins to fray. The third or fourth awakening finds that the chapter master has died and been replaced by a warrior the dreadnought barely knew. The fifth awakening reveals that his former squadmates have all fallen, their names inscribed on the memorial walls alongside thousands of others. The 10th awakening shows that even the warriors he advised during his earlier periods of wakefulness are now considered ancient veterans themselves, their careers spanning the entire gap since his last deployment. The fortress monastery has been expanded or rebuilt, incorporating new architectural styles that feel alien to his aesthetic sensibilities. By the 20th or 30th awakening, the dreadnought finds himself in a chapter that is familiar in name and heraldry only. Every single face is that of a stranger. The tactical doctrines have evolved in ways he doesn't fully understand, incorporating responses to enemies that didn't exist during his mortal life. Even the high Gothic spoken by the younger Marines has shifted, accumulated centuries of linguistic drift, creating barriers to easy communication. The dreadnought becomes a relic in truth, a piece of living history that the chapter reveres but no longer truly knows how to relate to on a personal level. This isolation is compounded by the physical reality of the dreadnought's existence. Encased within his sarcophagus, the pilot cannot engage in the small, informal interactions that build relationships between warriors. He cannot share a meal with his brothers, cannot train with them in the practice cages, cannot join them in the quiet moments between battles when bonds of friendship are forged and strengthened. Every interaction is formal, mediated by the massive and intimidating presence of his war machine chassis. The younger Marines approach him with respect, but also with a certain wariness, treating him more as a sacred object than as a fellow warrior. Moreover, the neural interface that allows the Dreadnought to control his mechanical body also begins to affect his consciousness in subtle but profound ways. The human brain is remarkably adaptable, capable of integrating new sensory inputs and learning to control prosthetic limbs with surprising efficiency. But when those prosthetics are as extensive as a full Dreadnought chassis, when nearly all of the pilot's sensory input comes through mechanical systems rather than organic senses, something fundamental begins to change. The pilot's sense of self starts to blur at the edges, his identity becoming increasingly enmeshed with the machine that houses him. Many ancient dreadnoughts report experiencing their existence in increasingly mechanistic terms. Emotions that once came naturally require conscious effort to access and express. Memories from their mortal lives take on a distant, dreamlike quality, as if they happened to someone else entirely. The fierce passion that once drove them to acts of heroism in battle becomes replaced by a colder, more calculated form of dedication to duty. They still fight for the chapter, still protect the Imperium, still serve the Emperor, but the emotional intensity that once characterized these commitments gradually fades, leaving behind only the mechanical execution of deeply ingrained programming. This process is not universal or uniform. Some dreadnoughts retain their humanity more successfully than others, finding ways to anchor their consciousness in the organic rather than the mechanical. They deliberately cultivate memories of their mortal existence, replaying significant moments over and over during the long periods of stasis to keep them fresh and vivid. They make conscious efforts to engage emotionally with the warriors around them when awakened, asking about their lives and concerns, offering advice that goes beyond pure tactical considerations. They fight against the slow drift toward mechanization with everything they have, determined to remain warriors rather than simply becoming weapons. But this fight grows harder with each passing century. The organic components of the pilot's body continue to age and deteriorate, despite the best efforts of the life support systems. Neurons die and are not replaced. Synaptic connections weaken and fail. The biological tissue that houses the pilot's consciousness, subjected to stresses it was never designed to endure, gradually breaks down at the cellular level. The tech marines can maintain the mechanical systems almost indefinitely, replacing worn components and upgrading systems with each new technological advancement. But they cannot halt the fundamental decay of the organic portions, can only slow it and compensate for it as best they can. As this biological decay progresses, the pilot's cognitive functions begin to suffer. Short-term memory becomes unreliable, forcing increased dependence on the sarcophagus's data recording systems. Processing speed slows, reaction times stretching from the superhuman to merely exceptional. The ability to form new memories weakens, making each awakening blend into the previous ones in an undifferentiated stream of battles and deployments. The pilot might find himself unable to remember whether a particular engagement happened last year or a century ago, whether the Marine who just addressed him is someone he spoke with during his previous awakening, or a complete stranger who happens to bear a resemblance to a warrior long dead. The chapter's leaders and tech Marines watch for these signs of degradation carefully. They must balance the pilot's continued usefulness as a weapons platform against the very real possibility that his failing consciousness might make him a liability on the battlefield. Some dreadnoughts, their organic minds degraded beyond the point of reliable function, are quietly retired, their sarcophagi sealed in places of honor, while the machine spirits of their chassis are allowed to dominate fully, creating semi-autonomous weapons that fight on instinct and programming rather than true consciousness. Others continue to serve, their pilots grimly holding onto their identity even as it slips through their fingers like water. It is against this background of isolation, decay, and the slow erosion of identity that we must understand what happens when a dreadnought awakens to discover its chapter destroyed. To fully grasp the magnitude of this catastrophe, we need to examine how such an awakening occurs and what a dreadnought actually experiences during those first terrible moments of comprehension. The awakening process for a dreadnought is a carefully orchestrated ritual that blends technology and faith in the manner typical of the Imperium. When the chapter's leadership determines that an ancient's services are required, whether for battle or for council, the relevant tech marines are dispatched to the stasis vaults where the dreadnoughts wait in hibernation. These vaults are typically located deep within the fortress monastery's most heavily fortified sections, protected by multiple layers of security and shielded by the strongest force fields the chapter possesses. The dreadnoughts that rest here represent irreplaceable assets, living links to the chapter's history that must be preserved at almost any cost. A tech marine approaching a dormant dreadnought must first perform a series of ritual prayers and blessings, appeasing both the machine spirit of the dreadnought chassis and asking for the Emperor's guidance in what is about to occur. These are not empty ceremonies, but essential components of the awakening process, at least from the Mechanicus-influenced perspective that dominates the Imperium's understanding of technology. The tech marine anoints the sarcophagus with sacred oils, burns incense to purify the surrounding air, and recites litanies that have been used for this purpose since the chapter's founding. Only after these spiritual preparations are complete does the tech marine begin the actual technical process of bringing the dreadnought back online. Power is gradually restored to the sarcophagus's systems, flowing from the fortress monastery's reactors through blessed conduits into the life support mechanisms. The amniotic fluids that sustain the pilot's biological tissue are heated to optimal temperature and circulated to remove accumulated waste products. Chemical balances are adjusted to begin reversing the deep metabolic suppression that characterizes stasis sleep. Neural inhibitors are carefully withdrawn, allowing electrical activity to resume in the pilot's brain. This process cannot be rushed. If awakened too quickly, the pilot risks suffering irreversible neural damage as his consciousness attempts to reassert itself before the biological substrate is ready to support it. The tech marines monitor hundreds of different metrics, watching for any signs of distress or malfunction, ready to abort the awakening if necessary, and return the dreadnought to stasis. The entire procedure typically takes several hours, though it can be accelerated in true emergencies at the cost of increased risk to the pilot. From the pilot's perspective, the experience of awakening is profoundly disorienting. Consciousness does not return all at once, but rather seeps back gradually, like water filling an empty vessel. The first sensations are typically vague and undefined, raw nerve impulses that the brain struggles to interpret without context. Pain comes early, a dull, pervasive ache that emanates from every part of the pilot's remaining biological tissue as it is coaxed back into full wakefulness. The amniotic fluids feel simultaneously warm and cold, their temperature perfectly calibrated, but still alien against skin that has not felt anything in subjective moments but objective decades. As consciousness strengthens, the pilot begins to receive input from the sensory systems of his dreadnought chassis. This input is initially overwhelming, a cascade of data far more extensive than organic senses could provide. Optical sensors deliver visual information across multiple spectrums simultaneously. Auspex arrays detect electromagnetic emissions, heat signatures, air currents, and seismic vibrations. Audio pickups capture sounds across a frequency range far exceeding biological hearing. All of this information floods into the pilot's brain, which must remember how to filter and process it into a coherent understanding of the surrounding environment. Experienced dreadnoughts, those who have undergone this process hundreds or thousands of times, have developed techniques for managing this sensory overload. They focus on one input stream at a time, building up a complete picture of their surroundings gradually, rather than trying to process everything at once. They rely on the autonomous systems of the sarcophagus to handle routine functions, while their consciousness fully reintegrates with the chassis. They have learned patience, understanding that the disorientation will pass as their neural pathways fully reconnect with the machine. But even for these veterans, each awakening carries a moment of profound vulnerability, a span of time during which the pilot's consciousness is present, but not yet fully functional. It is during this moment that the dreadnought is most acutely aware of what it has become, most conscious of the gulf between its current existence and the mortal life it once knew. The contrast is especially sharp if the pilot's last memories before entering stasis were of battle, full of adrenaline and the visceral intensity of combat. only to awaken to the sterile quiet of the stasis vault. Under normal circumstances, this moment of vulnerability is brief and carefully managed. The tech marines attending the awakening speak to the pilot, their voices providing a familiar anchor as consciousness returns. They explain why the awakening was necessary, brief the pilot on the current situation, and provide any context needed to understand the gap in time since the last deployment. The pilot is given time to fully reorient himself, to run diagnostic checks on all systems, to ensure that the integration between organic consciousness and mechanical chassis is proceeding smoothly. Only when the pilot confirms that he is fully functional does the awakening team clear him for deployment or escort him to wherever his presence is required. But when a dreadnought awakens to find its chapter destroyed, none of these normal protocols are followed because there is no one left to follow them. The awakening in such cases is either accidental, the result of automated systems continuing to function after all human oversight has ceased, or it is triggered by external actors, scavengers or explorers who have discovered the chapter's ruins and inadvertently activated the slumbering war machine. Imagine, then, what this awakening feels like for the pilot. Consciousness returns through the usual process, but something is immediately wrong. The expected voices of the tech marines are absent. The background noises that should accompany an awakening, the hum of the fortress monastery's power generators, the distant sounds of training exercises or maintenance work, the subtle vibrations of a living, functioning military installation, all of these are missing.
You know, when I first started researching this topic, I thought it would be straightforward, just another tragic story in a setting full of them. But the more I dug into what this experience would actually feel like, the more it got under my skin. There's something uniquely horrible about the idea of being kept alive specifically to serve your brothers, only to wake up and find them all gone. Like, the entire justification for your suffering just vanishes. And the best part? The Imperium would probably see nothing wrong with this. They would tell the Dreadnought he's honored to continue serving. Completely missing that service without purpose is just torture with extra steps. It's peak Warhammer 40K, taking something presented as noble and revealing the nightmare underneath. Anyways, I'm not gonna hold you guys any longer. Let's continue.
Instead, there is silence, broken only by the automated systems of the sarcophagus itself, completing their reactivation sequences. The pilot's optical sensors come online, expecting to see the familiar surroundings of the stasis vault. What they might see instead depends on the specific circumstances of the chapter's destruction and how much time has passed since that catastrophe occurred. Perhaps the vault is intact but abandoned, dust and decay covering surfaces that should gleam with polish and care. The sacred oils that should be regularly applied have dried to dark stains. The incense burners are cold and empty. The servo skulls that normally flit through the vault on maintenance tasks hang motionless from their charging stations, their power cells long since expired. Or perhaps the vault has suffered physical damage. Maybe battle scars mar the walls, evidence of fighting that reached into the very heart of the fortress monastery. Blast marks from melter weapons might have melted through reinforced doors. Bolter rounds might have cratered the sacred walls. The other dreadnought chassis that should rest in the vault might be damaged or destroyed, their sarcophagi cracked open to reveal the desiccated remains of their pilots, or simply empty, their precious contents long since removed by enemies or scavengers. In the absolute worst cases, the fortress monastery itself might have been destroyed entirely, the vault exposed to the elements, or even to the void of space. The dreadnought might awaken to find itself buried under rubble, its optical sensors showing nothing but darkness and stone. Or it might find the vault open to a poisoned sky, the world outside transformed by millennia of environmental catastrophe or deliberate exterminatus. The sensory data flooding the pilot's consciousness tells a story of utter devastation, even if that story is not yet fully understood. The pilot's first response to these wrong sensory inputs is typically confusion rather than alarm. The integration between organic mind and machine systems is not yet complete. Cognitive function not yet fully restored. The pilot might assume that he is misinterpreting the data, that his sensory systems are malfunctioning, that this is some kind of test or training scenario he doesn't remember being briefed about. The human mind, even the enhanced and augmented mind of a space marine, resists accepting catastrophic information immediately, especially when that information contradicts everything the pilot expects to experience. As full consciousness returns and cognitive function improves, the pilot begins actively seeking explanations for what he is perceiving. He attempts to access the Vox network, expecting to hear the familiar chatter of his battle brothers, coordinating their activities, the stern voices of officers issuing orders, the ritual prayers of chaplains echoing through the fortress monastery's many chapels. Instead, he receives only static, the carrier waves present, but devoid of any actual communication. He tries to ping specific Vox addresses, calling out to the Tech Marines, who should be overseeing his awakening, to the chapter master, to anyone who might respond. The silence that greets these attempts is absolute and terrible. The pilot runs diagnostic checks on his own systems, looking for technical explanations for the communications failure. Perhaps his Voxcaster is malfunctioning. Perhaps there is interference from an enemy jamming field. Perhaps he is simply out of range of the fortress monastery's main network. But the diagnostics return clean results. All systems are functioning within normal parameters. The problem is not with his equipment, but with the complete absence of anyone to communicate with. It is at this point that the first tendrils of real fear begin to penetrate the pilot's consciousness. Something is profoundly wrong. More wrong than a simple communications malfunction or an unusually quiet awakening could explain. The pilot begins to move, the massive frame of the Dreadnought responding to his will as servo motors and actuators translate neural impulses into mechanical motion. The movement feels strange after subjective moments but objective decades of immobility, the chassis requiring a few moments to fully limber up as lubricants redistribute through the system and joints work through their full range of motion. If the vault is intact, the Dreadnought moves toward the exit, seeking to leave this silent chamber and find other members of the chapter who can explain what is happening. The massive doors that seal the vault, designed to withstand tremendous punishment, should respond to his authorization codes, recognition systems, identifying him as a member of the chapter and granting him free passage. In a normal situation, these doors would already be open. The awakening team, having entered to oversee the reactivation process. Finding them still sealed is another anomaly in a growing list of things that don't make sense. The pilot transmits the authorization codes and waits for the doors to respond. In many cases, they do not. The automated systems that should recognize a Dreadnought's authority have failed, either from lack of maintenance, or from deliberate sabotage, or from simple age, if enough time has passed. The pilot is forced to override the security measures, using the superior strength of the Dreadnought chassis to physically force the doors open. Adamantium fingers dig into the seams where the doors meet. Hydraulic muscles strain against mechanisms designed to resist exactly this kind of forced entry. And with a screech of tortured metal, the vault is breached. Beyond the doors, the pilot expects to find the corridors of the fortress monastery, those familiar passages walked by generations of space marines in service to the chapter. What he actually finds varies tremendously based on the specific circumstances of the chapter's fall and the time that has elapsed since. In some cases, the corridors are physically intact, but showing obvious signs of abandonment. The eternal flames that should burn in braziers along the walls have gone out, leaving only cold ashes and the faint smell of ancient smoke. The honor guard servo skulls that should patrol these corridors are nowhere to be seen. The sacred banners that normally hang from the ceiling, each one commemorating a great victory or a fallen hero, are absent or have rotted to tatters. The pilot moves through these corridors, each step of the Dreadnought's massive feet echoing in the empty spaces. He heads toward areas where he expects to find other members of the chapter. The command center, where officers coordinate operations, the armory where warriors maintain their weapons, the apothecarium where the wounded receive treatment, the chapel where prayers are offered to the emperor. Each location he reaches is empty, showing varying degrees of disuse and decay. Equipment has been removed or destroyed. Records have been deleted or removed. The physical space remains, a shell that once housed a living chapter, but the essence, the people and purposes that gave it meaning, are gone. The psychological impact of this discovery unfolds in stages, each one more devastating than the last. The pilot's first response is often denial, a refusal to accept what the evidence clearly indicates. He searches more thoroughly, convinced that he is simply looking in the wrong places, that the chapter has been deployed elsewhere, that there is some logical explanation for the apparent abandonment. He accesses computer terminals, hoping to find log entries or deployment orders that will explain where everyone has gone. Many of these systems no longer function, their machine spirits having expired long ago without proper maintenance. Those that do work often provide information that only deepens the mystery, showing timestamps that indicate impossibly long periods of inactivity or final entries that hint at catastrophe without explaining its full scope. As the evidence accumulates, denial gives way to desperate hope. Perhaps the chapter fought a battle somewhere else and lost, the survivors scattering to regroup elsewhere. Perhaps they relocated the fortress monastery to a new location for strategic reasons. Perhaps this is all an elaborate deception, the chapter having staged their own disappearance to fool enemies or to pursue some secret mission. The pilot clings to these explanations, even as they grow more implausible, because the alternative, the truth that is slowly becoming undeniable, is too terrible to accept. The turning point often comes when the pilot reaches the Hall of Remembrance, that sacred chamber where every chapter maintains records of its fallen warriors. Space Marine chapters are meticulous about honoring their dead, inscribing each fallen brother's name onto walls or monuments or sacred scrolls. These records stretch back centuries or millennia, a complete accounting of every warrior who has given his life in service to the chapter. The pilot, searching for some clue to explain what has happened, consults these records, looking for patterns in recent casualties that might indicate the nature of the chapter's fate. What he finds, if the records are intact, is the story of his chapter's final days, written in names and dates of death. Perhaps there is a massive spike in casualties clustering around a specific time period, suggesting a single catastrophic engagement. Perhaps the deaths are spread out over an extended period, indicating a slow war of attrition that gradually depleted the chapter until it could no longer sustain itself. Perhaps the final entries are incomplete or hastily made, suggesting that the chapter's end came too quickly for proper record-keeping to be maintained. In some cases, the pilot might find a message left specifically for any Dreadnought who awakens after the chapter's fall. A chapter master or senior officer, knowing that their ancients sleep through long periods and might outlive the chapter itself, might have recorded an explanation of events, providing context for a catastrophe they knew was coming, but could not prevent. These messages, when they exist, are typically brief and formal, delivered in the clipped tones of military briefings, even as they describe events of earth-shattering personal significance to both the speaker and the listener. The message might describe an enemy of overwhelming power, a chaos incursion, or tyrannid hive fleet, or warg band, whose numbers and ferocity exceeded anything the chapter could withstand. It might detail a war of attrition fought across multiple worlds, watching helplessly as recruitment failed to keep pace with casualties until the chapter dwindled to a handful of survivors who made a final stand, knowing they would not prevail. It might speak of betrayal, another Imperial faction turning on the chapter due to political maneuvering or doctrinal disputes or simple miscommunication. It might describe a slow decline, the chapter gradually losing its combat effectiveness as gene seed degraded or critical equipment failed without replacement, until finally the chapter could no longer fulfill its duties and was quietly disbanded. Whatever the specific details, the message confirms what the pilot has been desperately trying to deny. The chapter is gone, not deployed elsewhere, not scattered to regroup, not hiding or relocated. Gone, destroyed, extinguished from history, like a candle flame snuffed out by careless fingers. Every Space Marine who once bore the chapter's colors is dead. The fortress monastery stands empty because there is no one left to occupy it. The silence that greeted the pilot's awakening was not a communications malfunction, but the simple absence of anyone to communicate with. This realization, when it finally penetrates the layers of denial and desperate hope, strikes the pilot with a force that no physical weapon could match. The psychological damage inflicted by this moment of comprehension is profound and multi-layered, attacking the pilot's sense of identity from multiple directions simultaneously. To understand why this is so devastating, we need to examine what the chapter represents to a space marine on a fundamental level, beyond the practical considerations of military organization and tactical coordination. A space marine's chapter is his entire world in ways that outsiders struggle to comprehend. From the moment an aspirant first sets foot in the chapter's fortress monastery, every aspect of his life becomes oriented around the chapter and its traditions. His training is designed not just to make him an effective warrior, but to indoctrinate him into the chapter's culture, to make him think and act and believe in accordance with the chapter's established norms. He learns the chapter's history, memorizing the names and deeds of heroes who lived centuries before his birth. He participates in the chapter's rituals, performing ceremonies that connect him to an unbroken chain of warriors stretching back to the chapter's founding. The process of becoming a space marine, which involves the implantation of 19 specialized organs over the course of several years, is itself a form of rebirth that severs the aspirant's connections to his previous life. He is no longer the person he was before, no longer tied to his biological family or his civilian identity. His new family is the chapter. His new identity is defined entirely by his role as a space marine, in service to the Emperor and the Imperium. The gene seed that catalyzes his transformation carries genetic material from the chapter's Primarch, creating a biological connection to his battle brothers that goes deeper than mere brotherhood of arms. This complete restructuring of identity means that a space marine quite literally cannot imagine his life outside the context of his chapter. The chapter is the lens through which he understands himself and his place in the universe. His accomplishments have meaning because they bring glory to the chapter. His struggles have purpose because they advance the chapter's goals. His eventual death, whenever and however it comes, will be meaningful because his gene seed will be harvested and implanted in new aspirants, ensuring that some part of him continues as part of the chapter's ongoing legacy. For a Dreadnought, these connections are, if anything, even more intense than they are for active warriors. The pilot has already lost his mortal body, already sacrificed the possibility of a normal death in battle. What keeps him anchored to existence, what gives his continued consciousness meaning and purpose, is his ongoing role within the chapter. He is the keeper of the chapter's memory, the living embodiment of its traditions, the bridge between past and present. Younger Marines look to him for guidance and inspiration. Officers consult him when facing strategic challenges similar to those he has encountered in his long career. His mere presence on the battlefield reassures his battle brothers and strikes fear into the enemy. To discover that the chapter no longer exists is to have this entire framework of meaning collapse in an instant. The pilot's identity, built up over centuries of service and reinforced through countless awakenings, suddenly has no foundation. He is a space marine without a chapter, a warrior without brothers to fight alongside, a keeper of traditions that have no one left to keep them for. Every memory he possesses, every experience that has shaped him, every relationship that has sustained him through the long periods of isolation, all of it becomes retroactive tragedy, stories of people and purposes that no longer exist, except in his increasingly unreliable memory. The emotional impact of this realization manifests in ways that are both recognizable and utterly alien to those who have never experienced it. Grief is present, certainly, a profound mourning for the loss of brothers and the end of a legacy that the pilot spent his entire existence serving and protecting. But this grief is complicated by the temporal dislocation inherent to Dreadnought existence. From the pilot's subjective perspective, these brothers might have been alive and well mere moments ago, his last conscious memory perhaps of fighting alongside them in battle. The temporal gap between that memory and the current reality, which might span decades or even centuries of objective time, feels artificial and wrong, as if he has been cheated of the gradual process of loss and mourning that normally helps the living come to terms with death. Anger is also present, though its targets are often unclear or irrational. Anger at the enemies who destroyed the chapter, Certainly. But also anger at the chapter's leadership for failing to prevent this catastrophe, anger at himself for being asleep during the chapter's final days, anger at the Tech Marines, who interred him for creating an existence that would allow him to outlive everything he cared about. This anger has nowhere to go, no productive outlet, because all possible targets are either dead or were acting according to the best information and intentions they possessed at the time. Guilt comes as well, the survivor's burden of continuing to exist when others have perished. The pilot might fixate on the fact that if he had been awakened during the chapter's final battle, his presence might have made a difference, might have tipped the scales toward victory rather than defeat. This is almost certainly a false belief. If a full chapter of Space Marines could not prevail against whatever destroyed them, a single additional Dreadnought would likely not have changed the outcome. But rationality offers little comfort in the face of overwhelming guilt. The pilot knows intellectually that his slumber was not his choice, that he had no control over when he was awakened or how long he remained in stasis. But emotion does not always defer to logic. Perhaps most devastating is the sense of purposelessness that settles over the pilot once the initial shock begins to fade. For his entire existence, first as a mortal space marine and then as a dreadnought, the pilot has defined himself through service to the chapter. Every action he has taken, every sacrifice he has made, every moment of pain or glory he has experienced, all of it was in service to something larger than himself. Now that larger purpose has been removed, leaving only the pilot's consciousness adrift in a universe that suddenly seems meaningless and arbitrary. This existential crisis is compounded by the practical reality of the pilot's situation. He is alone in a way that few beings in the Imperium ever experience. The fortress monastery, if it still stands, is a vast and empty tomb, its corridors echoing with his footsteps, and nothing else. There are no familiar faces to seek comfort from, no surviving battle brothers to share grief with, no chapter leadership to provide direction and purpose. The pilot is the last remnant of an organization that might have numbered 1,000 warriors at its peak, the sole survivor of a legacy that stretched back centuries or millennia, and he must bear this knowledge alone. The isolation is both physical and temporal. Physical, because the pilot is literally alone within the abandoned fortress monastery, separated from any other living being by the walls of his sarcophagus and the massive frame of his dreadnought chassis. Temporal because, even if the pilot eventually encounters other Imperial forces, the gulf of experience and perspective between him and any mortal humans he might meet is so vast as to be nearly unbridgeable. He has lived for centuries, has fought in wars those mortals cannot even imagine, has witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations they can barely comprehend. And yet all of that experience, all of that accumulated wisdom and perspective, is now contained entirely within his own consciousness, with no one to share it with or pass it on to. The question of what happens next, what choices are available to a dreadnought in this situation, depends heavily on the specific circumstances of the chapter's fall and the condition of the pilot himself. Some possibilities are more hopeful than others, but all of them require the pilot to fundamentally redefine his understanding of who and what he is. One option, perhaps the most straightforward, is for the pilot to attempt to continue the chapter's mission independently. The pilot might leave the abandoned fortress monastery and seek out enemies of the Imperium to fight, operating as a one-being crusade in memory of his fallen brothers. This approach has a certain romantic appeal. The image of a lone warrior carrying on the fight long after his entire chapter has fallen, but it is fraught with practical difficulties. A dreadnought, for all its combat power, requires substantial logistical support to maintain combat effectiveness over extended periods. The chassis needs regular maintenance to prevent mechanical failures. The weapons require ammunition and power cells. The life support systems consume medical supplies. The pilot's biological tissue needs nutrients and chemical balances that must be carefully maintained. Without a chapter's infrastructure to provide these resources, a solo dreadnought's operational lifespan is severely limited. The pilot might achieve a few spectacular victories, might even carve out a legendary reputation in whatever sector he operates in. But inevitably, the lack of support will take its toll. Ammunition will run out. Systems will fail. The pilot will be forced to make increasingly desperate choices, scavenging from battlefields and abandoned installations, perhaps even cooperating with dubious allies who can provide needed resources in exchange for the Dreadnought's combat services. This path also offers no solution to the deeper problem of purpose and meaning. Fighting enemies of the Imperium might provide temporary satisfaction, the familiar rhythms of battle offering a respite from existential questions, but without a chapter to fight for, the victories feel hollow. Each enemy destroyed is just another tally in a ledger that no one will ever read. Each battle won is just another day's survival, in an existence that suddenly seems to stretch forward endlessly, without clear purpose or destination. A second option is for the pilot to seek out another chapter and attempt to join them, transferring his allegiance to a new brotherhood. This has historical precedent. Space Marines have sometimes been absorbed into other chapters, following the destruction or disbanding of their original organization. But for a Dreadnought, this path presents unique challenges. The pilot carries within him the entire history and culture of his defunct chapter, centuries of memories and traditions that are not compatible with simply adopting a new identity. Moreover, other chapters might be reluctant to accept such a transfer, viewing the Dreadnought as a potential source of discord or as an uncomfortable reminder of their own mortality as organizations. If a transfer is attempted and accepted, the pilot faces the emotionally wrenching task of learning to define himself as part of a new brotherhood. He must adapt to different traditions, different tactical doctrines, different ways of honoring the Emperor and conducting warfare. The younger Marines of his new chapter will not understand his references to battles fought by his old brothers, will not share his reverence for heroes whose names mean nothing in their tradition, will not appreciate the subtle distinctions between how his old chapter did things and how they do them. The pilot becomes, in essence, an immigrant in a foreign culture, carrying memories of a homeland that no longer exists and that his new companions cannot fully understand or appreciate. Even if this integration is successful on a practical level, the pilot will always carry a sense of divided loyalty. Part of him will remain tied to the chapter that first recruited him, that transformed him from mortal to Space Marine, that interred him in his Dreadnought chassis. That original chapter's traditions and values will continue to inform his worldview even as he outwardly adopts the practices of his new brotherhood. He becomes a hybrid being, not quite belonging fully to either chapter, carrying the legacy of one while serving the purposes of another. A third possibility, grimmer but perhaps more honest, is for the pilot to accept that his existence has run its course and to seek an honorable end. This might involve undertaking a suicidal mission against overwhelming enemies, spending the last of his resources in one final, glorious charge that achieves some significant objective before his inevitable destruction. Or it might involve a more deliberate act, the pilot instructing his sarcophagus's systems to shut down permanently, choosing the peace of death over the agony of continued existence without purpose. This option is complicated by both practical and philosophical considerations. From a practical standpoint, the Imperium wastes nothing, and a functional Dreadnought represents a massive investment of resources and technology that could potentially benefit the Emperor's cause, even if its pilot's original chapter no longer exists. From a philosophical standpoint, the concept of suicide is generally abhorrent to Imperial culture, viewed as a rejection of the Emperor's gift of life and a failure to fulfill one's duty. A Space Marine who chooses death over continued service might be viewed as having abandoned his oaths and betrayed the trust placed in him. Yet there is also a counter-argument that continuous existence in a state of purposeless suffering serves no one and honors nothing. If the pilot has reached a point where his consciousness is sustained only by mechanical systems, where his organic components have degraded beyond the point of meaningful function, where every moment of wakefulness is agony that serves no larger purpose, then perhaps allowing that existence to end is not abandonment but rather acceptance of a natural conclusion. The pilot has served faithfully for as long as he was needed. Now that his chapter is gone and his service complete, rest is not surrender, but earned reward. A fourth option, one that requires a very specific set of circumstances, is for the pilot to attempt to rebuild his chapter from nothing. This might involve seeking out other surviving members of the chapter who were deployed elsewhere when the main body was destroyed, or attempting to find and recruit new aspirants using his chapter's gene seed if any supplies remain intact. This path is extraordinarily difficult and may be outright impossible depending on the specifics of the situation, but it offers the possibility of restoring some version of what was lost. The challenges of this approach are immense. Gene seed is a precious and tightly controlled resource in the Imperium, and the loss of a chapter's entire stock represents a catastrophe that cannot easily be remedied. Even if some gene seed remains intact in the abandoned fortress monastery, the pilot would need access to facilities and expertise to implant it properly, as well as a pool of aspirants who meet the stringent physical and psychological requirements for transformation into Space Marines. The training and indoctrination process that transforms aspirants into full-fledged Space Marines takes years and requires the guidance of experienced warriors who can pass on not just combat skills, but also the chapter's cultural traditions. A lone Dreadnought, no matter how experienced or dedicated, cannot realistically fulfill all these requirements. The pilot might be able to serve as an instructor in combat tactics and chapter lore, but he cannot perform the surgical procedures necessary to implant gene seed, cannot oversee the physical training regimens that condition aspirants' bodies, cannot provide the full range of experiences necessary to properly socialize new Space Marines into their roles. At best, the pilot might be able to preserve fragments of the chapter's legacy, teaching a few individuals some portion of what it meant to be part of the Brotherhood, but the result would be a pale shadow of the original organization. Moreover, attempting to rebuild a chapter without official sanction from the Administratum and the High Lords of Terror is technically heresy, a violation of the laws that govern the creation and maintenance of Space Marine chapters. The Imperium strictly controls which chapters exist and how many Space Marines can be created, both to prevent any single chapter from growing powerful enough to threaten Imperial authority, and to ensure that the precious resource of gene seed is not wasted or misused. A Dreadnought who attempts to rebuild his chapter independently might find himself branded a renegade, hunted by the very Imperium he has spent centuries serving. A fifth possibility, perhaps the strangest and most existentially fraught, is for the pilot to accept his new role as the living memorial to a dead chapter. Rather than attempting to continue the chapter's mission, or to join a new brotherhood, or to rebuild what was lost, the pilot instead becomes a keeper of memory, a walking archive who preserves the history and traditions of the extinct chapter for as long as his consciousness endures. This role requires no external validation or resources beyond what is necessary to maintain the Dreadnought's basic functions. It offers a form of purpose, though a melancholy one. The pilot becomes the last witness to events that would otherwise be forgotten, the sole repository of stories that would otherwise be lost. In this role, the pilot might seek out historians or remembrancers who could record his testimony, ensuring that some version of the chapter's legacy survives in written form even after his own eventual death. He might travel the Imperium, visiting worlds where his chapter once fought, speaking to populations who benefited from their protection, creating an oral history that preserves at least fragments of what has been lost. He might simply withdraw from active service, finding some remote location where he can exist in peace, replaying his memories over and over, holding on to the faces and voices of his battle brothers for as long as his failing organic mind will allow. This path offers a kind of dignity, a way of honoring the dead by refusing to let them be forgotten. But it is also profoundly lonely, an existence defined entirely by looking backward rather than forward, by preservation rather than action. The pilot becomes less a warrior and more a museum piece, valuable for the knowledge he contains but disconnected from the ongoing life of the Imperium. Each passing year brings him closer to the inevitable moment when his organic components finally fail completely, when the last memories of his chapter die with him, and the legacy he has tried so hard to preserve is reduced to whatever fragmentary records might survive in Imperial archives. The reality is that no single path is universally correct or appropriate for all Dreadnoughts who find themselves in this situation. Each pilot must make his own choice based on his individual circumstances, his psychological resilience, his remaining capabilities, and his personal understanding of what honor and duty require. Some pilots might attempt multiple approaches in sequence, first seeking to continue their chapter's mission independently, then attempting to join another chapter when that proves unsustainable, then finally accepting a role as memorial keeper when all other options have been exhausted. What we can say with certainty is that all of these paths are marked by profound suffering, an existential pain that has no easy remedy or clear endpoint. The pilot exists in a state of permanent bereavement, mourning losses that can never be recovered and carrying burdens that cannot be shared. The isolation that was already a fundamental aspect of Dreadnought existence becomes absolute. The temporal and psychological distance between the pilot and the rest of the Imperium widening to an unbridgeable gulf. This suffering is compounded by the pilot's awareness of his own gradual decline. The organic components that house his consciousness continue to deteriorate, and without a chapter's apothecaries and tech marines to monitor and maintain them, that deterioration accelerates. The pilot might find his memories becoming increasingly unreliable, key details of battles or conversations shifting and changing each time he recalls them. He might experience moments of confusion or disorientation, his consciousness briefly losing its grip on reality before snapping back into focus. He might discover that emotions that once came naturally now require conscious effort to access, his neural pathways becoming increasingly mechanistic as the biological tissue continues its slow death. In the most tragic cases, the pilot might outlive his own memories of the chapter he is trying to honor. The faces of his battle brothers blur and fade, their names becoming disconnected from the deeds he remembers them performing. The traditions and rituals that defined the chapter's identity lose their context and meaning, reduced to rote movements performed without understanding. The pilot becomes a ghost in the most literal sense, a consciousness that continues to exist but has lost all connection to the identity and purpose that once defined it. To better understand the full scope of this tragedy, we should examine some specific historical examples of chapters that have been lost and consider what their dreadnoughts might have experienced, if any survived the catastrophes that claimed their brothers. While many of these cases are fragmentary and incomplete, reconstructed from scattered records and unreliable accounts, they provide concrete illustrations of how chapter extinction can occur and what forms it might take. The Astral Knights provide one of the most dramatic examples of a chapter choosing deliberate extinction in service to the Imperium. During the campaign known as the Necron Assault on the Vashalhur system, the Astral Knights made the decision to board a Necron world engine, a planet-sized superweapon of immense destructive power. The entire chapter, nearly 1,000 Space Marines, teleported onto the surface of this massive construct, knowing they would never return. Their mission was to disable the world engine from within, sacrificing themselves completely to prevent it from destroying Imperial worlds. They succeeded, but at the cost of total annihilation. Not a single Astral Knight survived the mission. Now imagine an Astral Knight's dreadnought who was not included in this final deployment, perhaps because his sarcophagus was undergoing critical repairs, or because the teleportation systems couldn't safely transport his massive frame. This ancient awakens, expecting to rejoin his brothers, only to discover that they have achieved a glorious death fighting the Necrons while he remained behind. The entire chapter chose martyrdom and achieved it, writing their names in the Imperium's history as heroes who gave everything to protect humanity. And he was left behind, denied even the opportunity to die alongside his brothers in their finest hour. The psychological weight of this would be crushing. The pilot would have to grapple not just with the loss of his chapter, but with the knowledge that they achieved the death in glory that every Space Marine desires, while he was denied that same honor. He might question whether his exclusion from the final mission was deliberate, whether his brothers viewed him as less worthy or less capable than those who made the boarding assault. He might wonder if the chapter's leadership specifically chose to leave him behind, perhaps to serve as a living memorial to their sacrifice, and whether that represents an honor or a curse. The Firehawks present a very different kind of tragedy, one that involves uncertainty and unanswered questions that would torture any surviving dreadnought. This chapter disappeared entirely during warp transit in 963 M41. the entire fleet and all personnel simply vanishing without a trace. They were officially declared lost in the warp and struck from Imperial records. However, years later, Space Marines bearing the colors and heraldry of the Firehawks began appearing in Imperial war zones, their armor blackened and wreathed in flames, fighting with suicidal fury against the enemies of mankind before vanishing as mysteriously as they appeared. These beings, calling themselves the Legion of the Damned, are now considered either a separate entity entirely, or perhaps the tortured remnants of the Firehawks transformed by their time in the warp. A Firehawks Dreadnought who had been deployed separately from the main fleet, perhaps assigned to a mission that prevented him from boarding the ships when they made their ill-fated jump, would face a uniquely agonizing uncertainty. His brothers are not simply dead but missing, their fate unknown and perhaps unknowable. Are they truly gone, or do they exist in some transformed state within the warp? If the Legion of the Damned are indeed the Firehawks, should he attempt to join them? And if so, how? Can one even choose to become part of the Legion? Or is it a fate that befalls only those who experience specific circumstances during warp transit? The pilot might spend decades or even centuries searching for answers, investigating every sighting of the Legion of the Damned, trying to determine if his brothers live on in some form and whether reunion is possible. Each inconclusive investigation would reinforce the torture of not knowing, the inability to properly mourn because death has not been confirmed, the faint hope that somehow contact might be restored warring against the rational understanding that whatever happened to the Firehawks, they are not coming back in any form that would allow the Dreadnought to rejoin them. The Relictors offer an example of a chapter destroyed, not by external enemies, but by internal corruption and the Inquisition's response to it. This chapter developed an interest in studying chaos artifacts, believing they could better fight the ruinous powers by understanding their weapons and methods. This approach led them down a dark path, accumulating more and more tainted objects until the Inquisition declared them excommunicate traitorous and ordered their destruction. The Relictors were hunted down and exterminated, though some scattered remnants may still survive as renegades pursued across the galaxy. A Relictor's Dreadnought awakening after his chapter's excommunication would face a particularly complex moral and practical situation. If he was in stasis during the period when the chapter began collecting chaos artifacts, he bears no personal responsibility for the decisions that led to their downfall. Yet he is still marked by association, his chapter's heraldry now a sign of treachery rather than honor. Does he attempt to defend his chapter's memory, arguing that their intentions were pure even if their methods were flawed? Does he renounce his chapter entirely, declaring that they deserved their fate and distancing himself from their actions? Or does he acknowledge the complexity of the situation, recognizing both the valor his brothers showed in their earlier campaigns and the terrible mistakes they made in their later years? The practical implications are equally fraught. The pilot is technically a member of an excommunicated chapter, which makes him a legitimate target for Imperial forces. He might find himself hunted by the very Imperium he spent centuries serving, forced to either surrender to execution or go renegade himself despite having committed no personal crime. The injustice of this situation would be obvious to the pilot, but irrelevant to the inquisitorial forces pursuing him, who see only a dangerous loose end that must be eliminated to prevent potential contamination. The Rainbow Warriors, destroyed during the Battle of Signax, where they were betrayed by the Night Lords, demonstrate yet another form of chapter extinction. This was not a gradual decline or a chosen sacrifice, but a sudden, treacherous ambush that decimated the chapter before they could mount an effective defense. A Rainbow Warrior's Dreadnought, awakening to learn of this betrayal, would have to process not just grief, but rage and a burning desire for vengeance against the traitors who destroyed his brothers. The challenge for such a pilot would be channeling that rage productively. The Night Lords are a scattered and elusive warband, impossible to track down and destroy completely. The pilot might dedicate his remaining existence to hunting them, making whatever progress he can toward avenging his chapter, but knowing that complete vengeance is impossible. This would create a form of purpose, a driving motivation that could sustain him through the isolation and suffering. But it would be a dark and consuming purpose that offers no real peace or resolution. The Tiger Claws were destroyed by the Imperium itself when they were infected by a Gina Stealer cult, that had infiltrated their recruiting pool. The contamination was so complete that the Ordo Xenos ordered the chapter's complete extermination, and other Space Marine chapters were deployed to carry out this sentence. For a Tiger Claws Dreadnought, who was uninfected due to his removal from organic life, awakening to discover this would present an impossible situation. His chapter committed no deliberate treachery, but they were compromised at a genetic level that made their continued existence an unacceptable threat. Understanding intellectually why they had to be destroyed provides no emotional comfort when processing the loss. Moreover, such a pilot would have to live with the knowledge that other Space Marines, perhaps from chapters he had fought alongside and respected, were the ones who killed his brothers. The bonds between chapters, the shared identity as angels of death serving the Emperor, would have been violated in the most profound way. The pilot might understand the necessity while still feeling betrayed, recognizing that his brothers had to die while still mourning their loss and resenting those who carried out the sentence. The Soul Drinkers represent a chapter that has been declared renegade and hunted by the Imperium, though they continue to fight in what they believe is service to the Emperor's true vision. A Soul Drinker's Dreadnought would face the agonizing question of whether to continue fighting for a chapter that most of the Imperium now considers traitors, or whether to accept the Imperium's judgment and turn against his own brothers. Either choice would involve profound betrayal of something fundamental to his identity. If he chooses to remain loyal to the Soul Drinkers, he becomes a renegade himself, hunted and reviled despite centuries of loyal service. If he chooses to accept the Imperium's judgment, he becomes a traitor to his chapter, potentially even having to fight against warriors he once called brothers. The psychological torture of this choice, forced on someone whose entire identity is built around loyalty and service, would be immense. There is no clean answer, no option that allows the pilot to preserve his honor and integrity intact. Each of these examples illustrates different aspects of what can happen when a chapter is lost, and how a surviving dreadnought might experience that loss. The common thread running through all of them is the fundamental incompatibility between the pilot's essential identity as a member of his chapter and the reality that the chapter no longer exists in any form he can meaningfully relate to. Whether the chapter chose extinction gloriously, disappeared mysteriously, was corrupted and destroyed, was betrayed, or turned renegade, the result for the dreadnought is the same: the loss of the framework that gave his existence meaning. These historical examples also demonstrate the variety of circumstances that can lead to chapter extinction. Some chapters are destroyed in single catastrophic battles. Others decline gradually over time until they can no longer sustain themselves. Some are corrupted from within, while others are destroyed by external enemies or by the Imperium itself. This variety means that there is no single narrative of chapter loss, no universal experience that all surviving dreadnoughts share. Each pilot's tragedy is unique, shaped by the specific circumstances of how and why his chapter fell. Yet despite this diversity, certain psychological patterns recur across different cases. The initial shock and denial, the desperate search for survivors or explanations, the eventual acceptance of loss, and the struggle to find new purpose or meaning. These stages appear in nearly every account of a dreadnought discovering his chapter's destruction. The specific details vary, but the underlying emotional journey remains consistent, suggesting something fundamental about how consciousness processes trauma of this magnitude. Understanding these historical cases also helps us appreciate the full scope of what chapter extinction means for the Imperium. Each lost chapter represents not just the deaths of 1,000 warriors, but the permanent loss of unique tactical expertise, cultural traditions, gene seed stocks, and institutional knowledge accumulated over centuries or millennia. Some of this knowledge might be preserved in Imperial archives, but much of it exists only in the minds of the chapter's veterans, transmitted informally from generation to generation. When a chapter is destroyed, this informal knowledge dies with them, leaving gaps in the Imperium's capabilities that can never be fully recovered. For a dreadnought who survives his chapter, this adds another layer to his burden. He is not just the last survivor, but potentially the last repository of his chapter's unique expertise and traditions. If he fails to preserve and transmit this knowledge before his own death, it will be lost forever. This creates a sense of responsibility that can be overwhelming, particularly if the pilot's cognitive functions are already declining, and his ability to accurately recall and communicate this information is compromised. There is also the question of how the broader Imperium responds to a dreadnought in this situation. Assuming the pilot makes contact with other Imperial forces, rather than remaining isolated in the ruins of his chapter, the official response is likely to be complex and contradictory, reflecting the Imperium's general dysfunction and the competing interests of various factions. From a purely practical standpoint, a functional dreadnought represents a valuable military asset, regardless of its chapter affiliation. Imperial commanders facing overwhelming enemy forces might be willing to accept the dreadnought's assistance without asking too many questions about its origins or current status. The Inquisition, always hungry for weapons to use against humanity's enemies, might attempt to recruit the pilot for special operations where his unique capabilities and lack of formal organizational ties make him useful. The Adeptus Mechanicus, reverent toward ancient technology and knowledgeable about dreadnought systems, might offer technical support in exchange for opportunities to study the pilot and his chassis, but there would also be suspicion and concern. A dreadnought without a chapter is an anomaly in a culture that deeply distrusts anything that deviates from established patterns. Questions would be raised about how the chapter was destroyed, whether any taint of chaos or Xenos corruption might have been involved, whether the pilot's survival when all his brothers died suggests some form of cowardice or betrayal. The pilot might find himself subjected to interrogation by inquisitors, seeking to determine whether his continued existence represents a security risk. His gene seed, if it is from a lost chapter, might be confiscated for study or destroyed to prevent contamination of other bloodlines. The social response from other Space Marines would likely be equally complex. Space Marines generally hold great respect for dreadnoughts, viewing them as living embodiments of the warrior ideal and as repositories of tactical wisdom. A dreadnought from a destroyed chapter might receive sympathy and offers of assistance from individual Marines who recognize the tragedy of his situation, but institutionally, other chapters might maintain distance, wary of the ill fortune that seems to follow this lone survivor, or concerned about the diplomatic complications that might arise from too closely associating with a warrior whose chapter no longer exists in any official capacity. In the worst-case scenario, the pilot might find himself branded a renegade or even hunted as a potential threat. The Imperium's bureaucracy is notoriously inflexible and often unable to cope with situations that don't fit neatly into established categories. A dreadnought who refuses to stand down or who attempts to continue operating without official authorization might be classified as a threat to Imperial order, regardless of his actual intentions or his centuries of loyal service. The very assets that make him valuable as a warrior, his combat power, his tactical knowledge, his independence from normal chains of command, also make him dangerous from the perspective of Imperial authorities who prize control and conformity above all else. Throughout all of this, the pilot must grapple with questions of identity and purpose that would challenge anyone, but are particularly acute for a being whose consciousness has been shaped by centuries of service to a specific organization. Who is he? If not a member of his chapter, what does his continued existence mean, if not service to his brothers? How does he define honor and duty when the framework that previously gave those concepts meaning has been destroyed? Some pilots find new sources of meaning in unexpected places. They might form attachments to individual humans they encounter, viewing the protection of these mortals as a continuation of their oath to defend the Imperium. They might develop philosophical or theological interests, spending the long periods between battles contemplating the nature of the Emperor's plan and humanity's place in the universe. They might focus on specific enemies, dedicating themselves to the destruction of whatever faction was responsible for their chapter's fall, transforming grief into a focused crusade of vengeance. Others never fully recover from the psychological blow of losing their chapter. They continue to exist, to function in a mechanical sense, but the spark that once defined their personality gradually fades. They become less warriors and more weapons, executing their programming with mechanical precision, but no longer truly conscious of their own existence in any meaningful sense. The organic components of their minds atrophy from disuse, and the machine components dominate increasingly, until finally, there is nothing left but a semi-autonomous system that fights on reflex and ancient conditioning rather than any genuine understanding or purpose. The tragedy of this fate is that it represents a kind of death in life, a loss of everything that made the pilot who he was, even as his consciousness technically continues. The pilot becomes exactly what he once feared becoming: a ghost in a machine, a consciousness so eroded by time and trauma that it can no longer sustain itself, sustained only by mechanical systems that don't know how to let go. This lingering half-existence might continue for years, or even decades, after any genuine self-awareness has ceased. The pilot's body continuing to fight battles that his mind no longer comprehends for reasons it can no longer remember. In contemplating all of these possibilities, we confront one of the fundamental tragedies embedded in the lore of Warhammer 40,000. The way that the Imperium's attempts to preserve its heroes often result in their prolonged suffering. The Dreadnought program, presented as an honor that allows worthy warriors to continue serving beyond the natural limits of mortality, reveals itself upon closer examination as a form of torture that extends consciousness beyond the point where it can find meaning or comfort. The pilot is denied the clean death in battle that most Space Marines view as the ideal end to a life of service, instead being forced to watch as everything that gave that service meaning gradually slips away. This is not to say that all dreadnoughts suffer in this way, or that entombment is never a genuine blessing for those who undergo it. Many pilots find ways to maintain their humanity and purpose across the centuries, finding satisfaction in their continued service and taking pride in their role as teachers and counselors to younger generations. The bonds they form with their battle brothers, though different from those they knew as mortal warriors, can still be genuine and sustaining. The knowledge that they continue to protect humanity and serve the Emperor can provide authentic meaning even in the face of isolation and physical degradation. But when a dreadnought awakens to find his chapter destroyed, all of the potential positive aspects of entombment are stripped away, leaving only the suffering. The pilot is confronted with the full horror of what has been done to him in the name of honor and duty, forced to continue existing long past the point where that existence serves any purpose beyond the purely mechanical prolongation of consciousness. He becomes a living monument to the Imperium's casual cruelty, its willingness to sacrifice any individual's well-being for the sake of abstract concepts like honor and tradition. The specific details of how this plays out vary tremendously based on individual circumstances, but certain themes recur across different accounts and examples. The initial period of discovery and comprehension is almost universally described as the most acutely painful, the moment when hope and denial finally collapse under the weight of undeniable evidence. This is followed by a longer period of adjustment, during which the pilot attempts to construct some new framework of meaning that can sustain him going forward. The success or failure of this adjustment period often determines whether the pilot is able to maintain his identity and find some form of peace, or whether he gradually descends into the mechanical half-existence described earlier. For some pilots, this adjustment is facilitated by contact with other survivors or sympathetic allies who can provide external validation and support. A pilot who encounters another Imperial force that welcomes him and values his contribution might find it easier to redefine his purpose around service to the broader Imperium rather than to his specific chapter. A pilot who manages to locate even one other survivor from his chapter, perhaps a Marine who was deployed elsewhere when the main body was destroyed, might be able to maintain his original identity by focusing on his relationship with that individual survivor. For others, the adjustment never really occurs. These pilots remain psychologically frozen at the moment of discovery, unable to move forward or adapt to their new circumstances. They might continue to function, to fight battles and complete missions, but always with the sense that they are simply going through motions while waiting for an end that seems to never arrive. The passage of time becomes increasingly abstract and meaningless, months and years blending together into an undifferentiated stream of existence that serves no discernible purpose. What makes this situation particularly cruel is that it represents the intersection of two separate forms of suffering that compound each other in ways that are difficult for those who haven't experienced them to fully understand. The first is the grief and loss that comes from the death of the chapter, a trauma that would be devastating even for someone experiencing it under normal circumstances. The second is the existential horror inherent to Dreadnought existence itself, the slow erosion of identity and purpose that occurs when consciousness is maintained artificially across timescales it was never designed to comprehend. When these two forms of suffering combine, when a being who is already struggling with isolation and the decay of his organic mind must also cope with the loss of the one thing that gave his continued existence meaning, the result is a psychological catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. The pilot is simultaneously mourning a recent loss and grappling with the accumulated trauma of centuries of intermittent existence, processing fresh grief through neural pathways that have been damaged by age and artificial hibernation, trying to construct new meaning in a context where the very concept of meaning has become increasingly abstract and difficult to grasp. To make matters worse, the pilot typically has no one to share this suffering with, no support network that can help him process and integrate the trauma he has experienced. In a normal situation, a space marine dealing with loss or trauma can turn to his battle brothers for support, finding comfort in shared grief and collective mourning. A dreadnought who loses his chapter has no one to turn to, no fellow survivors who can understand what he is going through, no shared context that would allow others to fully comprehend the magnitude of his loss. Even if the pilot attempts to explain his situation to others, the barriers to communication are immense. How does one convey to someone who has never experienced Dreadnought existence what it feels like to awaken after subjective moments, but objective decades, to find everything you knew destroyed? How does one explain the specific quality of grief that comes from losing brothers you were fighting beside in what feels like yesterday, but who actually died generations ago? How does one communicate the existential vertigo of being simultaneously the newest and oldest member of an organization that no longer exists? The temporal dislocation inherent to Dreadnought existence compounds these communication difficulties. From the pilot's perspective, his chapter's destruction is both immediate and distant, a recent trauma that occurred in a past he didn't consciously experience. He is simultaneously the newest witness to the chapter's fall, having just learned about it, and the oldest survivor, having potentially outlived the actual moment of destruction by decades or centuries. This creates a strange psychological state where the pilot is processing information that is both fresh and ancient, responding to a crisis that is both immediate and long past. This temporal confusion can manifest in various ways, some of which might be mistaken for mental instability or cognitive decline by outside observers. The pilot might shift between talking about the chapter in present and past tense, his consciousness not yet having fully integrated the fact of their destruction. He might refer to dead battle brothers as if they are still alive, then correct himself moments later, the reality of their deaths reasserting itself over older patterns of thought. He might experience moments of dissociation where he temporarily loses track of when he is, his consciousness slipping into memories so vivid that they momentarily eclipse present reality. These symptoms, while understandable given the circumstances, can make it difficult for the pilot to form new relationships or to integrate into new organizations. Other Imperial personnel, unfamiliar with the specific challenges of Dreadnought psychology, might interpret these behaviors as signs of unreliability or instability. They might question whether the pilot can be trusted in combat situations where split-second decisions are required, or whether his compromised mental state represents a security risk that outweighs his value as a military asset. The pilot, aware of these perceptions and struggling to maintain what remains of his identity and dignity, might respond by withdrawing further, limiting his interactions with others to minimize the risk of being judged incompetent or dangerous. This creates a vicious cycle where isolation breeds further psychological deterioration, which in turn justifies and reinforces the isolation, gradually pushing the pilot further away from any possibility of recovery or integration into new support networks. In some cases, the isolation becomes so complete that the pilot essentially gives up on maintaining meaningful connections with the outside world. He might retreat to some remote location, finding a planet or asteroid or derelict ship where he can exist in solitude, emerging only occasionally to defend against threats that venture too close to his chosen sanctuary. In this state, the pilot becomes less a warrior and more a hermit, a consciousness that has withdrawn from the universe because continued engagement with it has become too painful to bear. This hermitage might last for years or decades, during which the pilot's already tenuous grip on identity and purpose continues to erode, without regular interaction with others to remind him of who and what he is, without missions and objectives to provide structure and meaning to his existence. The pilot might find his consciousness gradually dissolving into the machine systems that sustain it. The organic and mechanical components of his being, which should remain distinct even when closely integrated, begin to blur together. The pilot might start to think of himself in increasingly mechanistic terms, describing his thoughts as processes and his emotions as system states, losing the capacity to distinguish between the consciousness he once possessed and the programming that now dominates his existence. Yet even in these extreme cases of deterioration and withdrawal, there often remains some spark of the original consciousness, some fragment of the warrior who was first interred in the Dreadnought chassis. This remnant might manifest as unexpected behaviors or responses that don't fit the mechanical patterns that have come to dominate the pilot's existence. A hermit Dreadnought who has seemingly lost all connection to his former identity might suddenly come to the defense of nearby civilian populations when they are threatened, responding to deep-seated programming that insists Space Marines protect humanity, even when the conscious mind no longer remembers why. A pilot who has stopped speaking or communicating in any meaningful way might suddenly deliver detailed tactical briefings when presented with combat situations similar to those he faced in his mortal life, ancient training and experience overriding the general decay of his cognitive functions. These glimpses of the original consciousness, brief as they might be, raise profound questions about the nature of identity and the persistence of self. If a Dreadnought pilot's organic brain has deteriorated to the point where most higher cognitive functions have ceased, but some core elements of personality and training remain accessible, is the being that continues to exist still the same person who was first interred? Or has a new entity emerged, one that shares some characteristics with the original, but is fundamentally different in nature and capacity? These are not merely philosophical questions, but ones with practical implications for how other Imperial forces should interact with such diminished pilots. Should they be treated as honored veterans deserving of respect and care, or as damaged equipment that might be better retired or repurposed? Should attempts be made to restore them to some semblance of their former functionality, or should they be allowed to continue their deterioration in peace? The answers to these questions often depend less on the actual condition of the pilot and more on the specific priorities and values of whoever encounters them. Throughout all of this suffering and decline, there remains the fundamental question that haunts every Dreadnought who finds himself in this situation. Why? Why was he preserved when his battle brothers were allowed to die? Why did the awakening sequences that should have brought him back to serve alongside his chapter instead activate too late, or not at all during their time of need? Why does he continue to exist when everything he fought for has been destroyed? These questions typically have no satisfying answers. The mechanisms that determine when a Dreadnought is awakened are often automated or semi-automated, following protocols established centuries earlier and executed by servitors or machine spirits that have no capacity for judgment or discretion. A pilot might have remained in stasis during his chapter's final battle simply because the relevant automated systems were damaged or destroyed before they could trigger his awakening sequence. Or perhaps the tactical situation didn't meet the specific threshold criteria that would have authorized his deployment. Or perhaps the decision-makers who normally would have ordered his awakening were themselves killed early in whatever catastrophe destroyed the chapter, leaving no one with the authority or knowledge to bring him back online. The randomness of survival in such cases can be particularly difficult to accept. The pilot might have been spared not because of any special worthiness or purpose, not because the Emperor had plans for him to fulfill or enemies for him to face, but simply because of the vagaries of timing and circumstance. This recognition that his continued existence is essentially arbitrary and meaningless can be more psychologically damaging than if he could identify some specific reason or purpose for his survival. Some pilots attempt to retroactively construct meaning around their survival, convincing themselves that they were preserved for some higher purpose that has yet to reveal itself. They might interpret their continued existence as the Emperor's will, believing that they have been kept alive to fulfill some specific mission or to bear witness to events that will only make sense in hindsight. This belief can provide comfort and structure, giving the pilot a framework for understanding his situation that doesn't require him to accept the possibility that his survival was merely random chance. But this constructed meaning is fragile and vulnerable to challenges. As years pass without any clear purpose revealing itself, as the pilot's continued existence seems to serve no larger goal beyond simply continuing to exist, the belief in some higher plan becomes harder to maintain. The pilot might find himself cycling between periods of faith, where he genuinely believes he was preserved for important reasons, and periods of despair, where the absence of any evident purpose drives him to question whether there is any meaning to be found at all. The broader implications of these individual tragedies extend beyond the suffering of the pilots themselves, to touch on fundamental questions about the Imperium's relationship with its heroes and its approach to honoring service. Sacrifice. The Dreadnought program represents one of the Imperium's characteristic paradoxes, an institution that simultaneously expresses genuine reverence for warriors who have given everything in service to humanity and inflicts terrible suffering on those same warriors in the name of that reverence. The decision to enter a fatally wounded space marine in a Dreadnought chassis is almost always framed as an honor, a recognition of that warrior's exceptional service and a gift of continued existence that allows him to keep serving the Emperor beyond the normal limits of mortality. But the actual experience of Dreadnought existence, particularly when it extends across multiple centuries and culminates in awakening to find one's entire chapter destroyed, reveals this honor to be a curse that few would willingly accept if they fully understood what it entailed. This disconnect between the stated purpose of the Dreadnought program and its actual effects on the pilots raises uncomfortable questions about the Imperium's values and priorities. Does the program actually serve the interests of the interred warriors? Or does it primarily serve the interests of the chapter and the broader Imperium by extracting every last bit of utility from warriors who should have been allowed to die with dignity? Are the pilots' continued suffering and isolation justified by the combat effectiveness they provide? Or does their use represent a form of exploitation that violates the very principles the Imperium claims to uphold? These questions become particularly acute when we consider cases where a Dreadnought outlives his chapter. In such situations, the original justification for the pilot's preservation, that he would continue to serve and protect his battle brothers, is revealed to be false. The pilot continues to exist not because doing so serves any meaningful purpose, but simply because the mechanisms that sustain him lack the capacity to recognize that the purpose has been lost and shut themselves down. He becomes a ghost ship, continuing on his course long after the crew has died and the destination has ceased to exist, maintained by automated systems that don't know how to do anything else. The comparison to a ghost ship is apt in more ways than one. Just as a derelict vessel might drift through space for centuries, potentially causing damage if it collides with inhabited systems or interfering with shipping lanes, a Dreadnought who has outlived his chapter and lost his sense of purpose might represent a threat to others even without intending harm. His deteriorating mental state might lead to unpredictable behavior. His combat power might be turned against Imperial forces if he suffers a psychotic break and begins perceiving enemies where none exist. His mere presence might destabilize situations that would otherwise resolve peacefully, his appearance triggering conflict through misunderstanding or overreaction. Yet destroying such a Dreadnought, or even just forcibly shutting him down against his will, poses its own moral and practical challenges. From a moral standpoint, the pilot has served the Imperium faithfully for centuries, sacrificing everything, including his own humanity, in service to the Emperor. To end his existence simply because he has become inconvenient seems like a betrayal of everything the Imperium claims to value about loyalty and service. From a practical standpoint, dreadnoughts are formidable opponents, even when their pilots are diminished, and attempting to forcibly retire one might result in significant casualties and collateral damage. The result is often a kind of uneasy tolerance, where Imperial authorities who encounter such diminished dreadnoughts attempt to manage them rather than confront them. They might attempt to steer the pilots toward useful activities, providing them with targets to fight or objectives to achieve that channel their remaining combat effectiveness in productive directions. They might assign handlers or liaisons who attempt to monitor the pilot's mental states and intervene before deterioration leads to dangerous behavior. They might simply avoid the pilots when possible, allowing them to drift through Imperial space as long as they don't cause too much disruption. None of these approaches really addresses the fundamental tragedy of the situation or provides the pilots with anything approaching peace or resolution. They are band-aid solutions applied to a problem that has no good solution, attempts to minimize harm in a situation where harm has already occurred on such a massive scale that minor mitigations feel almost meaningless. The pilots continue to suffer, continue to deteriorate, continue to exist in a state that brings them no joy and serves no clear purpose, until finally their organic components fail completely and the suffering ends. But even this final ending is not always clean or dignified. Some pilots' consciousnesses fragment as they die, portions of their personality becoming trapped in the machine systems that house them, creating ghost-like echoes that continue to influence the Dreadnought chassis even after the organic brain has ceased functioning. These remnant consciousnesses, if they can even be called that, lack the coherence and continuity of full persons, but retain enough of the original pilot's patterns and memories to create the unsettling impression of a consciousness that refuses to fully die. The Dreadnought chassis itself, even after being cleared of organic components and consecrated for reuse, might retain traces of its former pilot in ways that go beyond normal machine spirits. Future pilots interred in the same chassis sometimes report hearing voices or experiencing visions that seem to come from previous occupants, as if the sarcophagus itself has absorbed something of the consciousnesses it has housed over the centuries. Whether these experiences represent genuine psychic phenomena or are simply the products of stressed organic minds trying to make sense of the strange interface between flesh and machine is a matter of debate among tech priests and SPR librarians. What is certain is that the suffering of a dreadnought who awakens to find his chapter destroyed does not necessarily end with that pilot's eventual death. The trauma and tragedy ripple outward, affecting those who knew the pilot, those who encounter him during his final years, and potentially even future pilots who inherit his chassis. The story becomes part of the chapter's legacy, or in cases where the chapter is truly extinct, part of the broader lore of the Imperium, another tale of sacrifice and suffering added to the countless others that define life in the 41st millennium. As we approach the conclusion of this exploration, we should consider what the experience of a dreadnought discovering his chapter's destruction tells us about the broader themes and nature of Warhammer 40,000 as a setting. This scenario, tragic and horrifying as it is, represents in concentrated form many of the core elements that make the setting distinct: the casual cruelty of the Imperium toward those who serve it most faithfully, the way that honors and rewards often turn out to be forms of punishment, the grinding weight of time and entropy that reduces even the mightiest warriors to shells of their former selves, and the ultimate futility of individual suffering in a universe that is fundamentally indifferent to such concerns. The Dreadnought's tragedy also highlights the tension between the individual and the collective that runs through all of Space Marine lore. Space Marines are trained to subsume their individual identities into their chapter, to find meaning and purpose through service to a brotherhood that is larger and more enduring than any individual warrior. This collectivist orientation serves important purposes during the Marines' mortal lives, creating the cohesion and selflessness necessary for them to function as effective military forces. But when a dreadnought outlives his chapter, this very orientation becomes a source of profound suffering, leaving him with no framework for understanding himself as an individual separate from the collective that defined him. In this way, The Dreadnought's experience serves as a dark mirror to the Imperium's broader approach to its citizens. Just as the Imperium teaches individuals that their value comes entirely from their service to humanity as a whole, that personal happiness and fulfillment are irrelevant compared to the survival of the species, the Space Marine is taught that his worth derives entirely from his role within the chapter. And just as this teaching can leave Imperial citizens psychologically devastated when they are no longer able to serve, unable to find meaning in an existence that has been entirely defined by external purpose, the Dreadnought finds himself adrift when the chapter that gave his existence meaning ceases to exist. Yet there is also something profound in the way that some Dreadnoughts manage to find new sources of meaning despite these overwhelming challenges. The pilots who successfully redefine themselves, who find ways to honor their fallen chapter while still moving forward, who manage to maintain their humanity despite centuries of isolation and suffering, represent a kind of resistance to the universe's fundamental indifference. They demonstrate that consciousness, however damaged or constrained, retains some capacity for adaptation and growth, that meaning can be constructed even in the absence of obvious purpose, that the individual will to endure has value regardless of whether that endurance serves any larger goal. These success stories, rare as they might be, offer a counterpoint to the overwhelming grimness of the setting. They suggest that even in the grim darkness of the far future, even in a universe where there is only war and suffering, individual beings can find ways to assert their dignity and to create islands of meaning in an ocean of chaos. The Dreadnought, who manages to preserve his identity and find new purpose after losing his chapter, achieves a kind of victory that is perhaps more significant than any number of military triumphs, a demonstration of the resilience of consciousness and the stubborn refusal of some beings to be entirely defined by their circumstances. But we must be careful not to overstate this hopeful reading, or to suggest that such resilience is always possible, or even desirable. For every Dreadnought who successfully adapts to his new reality, there are likely many more who succumb to despair or deterioration, who spend their final years in suffering that serves no purpose and achieves no positive outcome. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is fundamentally tragic, and individual acts of resilience, while meaningful to those who perform them, do little to change the broader patterns of suffering and loss that define the setting. Moreover, there is something troubling about the way that narratives of resilience and adaptation can be used to justify or minimize the original injustice. If we focus too much on the Dreadnoughts who manage to find new meaning after losing their chapters, we risk losing sight of the fact that they should never have been placed in such a situation in the first place, that the suffering they endure is not natural or inevitable, but rather the product of specific institutional decisions about how to treat wounded warriors. The real tragedy is not that some pilots fail to adapt, but that any of them are forced to try. In considering the full scope of what it means for a Dreadnought to discover his entire chapter is dead, we are confronted with a form of suffering that is almost incomprehensible in its magnitude and complexity. It combines physical isolation with temporal dislocation, combines fresh grief with accumulated trauma, combines the loss of purpose with the deterioration of the very consciousness that might otherwise process and integrate that loss. It is suffering that exists at the intersection of multiple different forms of horror, each one amplifying and intensifying the others in ways that create something worse than the sum of their parts. And perhaps most troubling of all, it is suffering that occurs largely in silence and isolation, witnessed by no one except the pilot himself and whatever distant observers might occasionally cross his path. The Dreadnought's tragedy unfolds in the empty corridors of abandoned fortresses and the vast silences between stars, his pain acknowledged by no memorial or monument, his struggle recognized by no record or remembrance. When he finally dies, his passing might go entirely unnoted, another lost consciousness in a universe that loses them by the billions, distinguished from civilian casualties only by the particularly cruel manner in which his continued existence was prolonged. If you found this exploration of Dreadnought psychology and the tragedy of losing an entire chapter compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me create more deep dives into the darker corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore exploring the human cost behind the setting's endless wars and examining the experiences of individuals caught in the grinding machinery of the Imperium. There is much more to explore in this grim darkness, and your engagement lets me know that these detailed, thoughtful examinations of the setting's most tragic aspects are valuable to you. Thank you for watching, and may the Emperor protect you, even if that protection comes in forms you would never choose for yourself.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.